All right, so our prompt here is about the extent to which westward migration and U.S. policies, so we're talking about the government and westward migration, we're talking about American settlers moving west, fostered change in the relationship between American settlers and native tribes in the years 1830 to 1887. Okay, so 1830, this begins our timeline for our graphic organizer here, and that starts chosen because that's the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson. This is where Native Americans were kind of forced to abandon their land. We're talking about the Cherokee and the tribes in the southeast, like in the Georgia area. Um, so on our timeline, we're ending in 1887, which is significant because that's when the Dawes Act occurred, which is kind of a government policy that attempted to assimilate Native Americans. So white education, so schools to speak English, to kind of learn American culture, Christianity, so Christianizing the natives. No tribal ownership of land. Instead, it was individual ownership, helping Native Americans learn how to farm, which kind of wasn't their lifestyle traditionally. So this is about assimilating Native Americans into kind of American culture. So in between these two events, we have a variety of other events here. I'm going to kind of divide this up into three parts. Our first part here is kind of the goes along with the Indian Removal Act, of just the act of removing Native Americans from their lands. So this idea of the concentration policy, these treaties that were kind of unfair to Native Americans. They favored the white people. They restricted Native Americans to certain areas. They had some kind of short-term effects. We have the Trail of Tears in 1838. This is kind of the most famous example of Indian removal. The so-called five civilized tribes in the southeast removed to what is now Oklahoma, the Indian Territory. You also have the establishment of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1836. Okay, this is a kind of a poorly managed federal agency, at least in the beginning. It's known for its corrupt and dishonest officers. We also have some things that kind of don't fit this kind of mold of removing Native Americans from land. First is the case Worcester versus Georgia. This is the famous case where John Marshall sides with the Native Americans against the state of Georgia. But this is also the case that Jackson famously ignored, that said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, right? And so Jackson kind of ignored this Supreme Court decision. So that kind of sort of runs counter to the idea of Indian removal. You also have some resistance from Native Americans. You have the Black Hawk War, which is this really kind of vicious war against the Native Americans in Illinois by white settlers there. You also have the Seminole Wars, one of the more successful examples of Native resistance. The Seminoles are a tribe in Florida, and you also have some runaway slaves, some runaway African American slaves that were helping to fight against the U.S. Army. And so the U.S. government actually abandoned this war after about 7 years. So this is probably the most successful example of Native American resistance. Around that same time, in terms of Western migration, we have the Oregon Trail in the 1840s of Americans moving west along that trail and actually seeking help from Native Americans in terms of guiding them through mountain passes and that sort of thing. And this, along with that, is this attitude of manifest destiny, this belief that the U.S. was kind of meant to spread west to the Pacific. So this is kind of the background of Indian removal, is that Americans believe that they deserve this land, and they're moving Native Americans off the land in things like the Trail of Tears to make room for American settlers that will use the land, quote unquote, properly. Okay. Our next phase is kind of the 1860s, 1870s. This is a much more violent phase. We have the Sand Creek massacre here in 1864, where women and children are killed. You have kind of vigilante groups, so not military, but kind of American civilians that go Indian hunting, and this idea that they're out to hunt and kill Native Americans. And in the 1870s, we have the Battle of Little Bighorn, where the Sioux kind of defeat General Custer with one of the largest Native American forces that was assembled. But eventually, what happens is the United States military comes back after this defeat at Little Bighorn, and they defeat Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, Native American leaders, in the Second Sioux War. You also have the surrender of Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce Indians. They kind of surrendered to the Native Americans, and Chief Joseph gives the famous speech where he's basically saying that he's tired of fighting and he just wants to go home, back to his land, which is this reservation in Idaho. The U.S. government, however, did not allow them to keep that promise. So this is kind of a consistency throughout here, where you have treaties that are unfair, or the U.S. government not keeping its promises, broken promises throughout this whole time period. In the backdrop here, we have Westward movement too of the Homestead Act, right? So this is cheap or free land for settlers. They get, for white settlers, they get 160 acres of land. And as long as they live on it and improve it for 5 years, they get that land free or very cheaply. And so, but the land that is being offered is kind of not the greatest land. It's difficult to be successful. But later on, there'll be other examples of laws like the Timber Act and a few others that kind of specify or try and get Americans to settle certain types of land in certain ways. There's the Desert Land Act, which is in the 1870s, which talks about how if you improve the land by irrigating it, you get that land free. So there's several of these kinds of laws that are passed to help Americans settle the land cheaply. You also have the Indian Peace Commission, which is set up to create kind of two larger reservations in the Dakotas. And again, we have this idea of broken promises, kind of bribery, taking advantage, tricks, that sort of thing, going back to the concentration policy, and then kind of the broken promises of after Chief Joseph. So, and then we kind of wrap up with the Dawes Act, which I mentioned earlier. So when you're looking at this time period, you kind of see three distinct time periods. The first time period is kind of this removal of Native Americans against a backdrop of American expansion and manifest destiny. Then we get into that kind of this more violent phase of Native American and American relationships, where Native Americans resist and American military and civilians kind of fight very brutally against Native Americans. And then we kind of end this time period with the idea of assimilation, because by this point there actually weren't too many Native Americans left. Kind of the victory of the U.S. military is pretty much complete at this point. There's two events that occur after 1887, which I think are useful to know, which is the ghost dance movement. This is this kind of spiritual revival of Native American spiritual beliefs. It's based on the idea that white people will eventually go back to where they kind of came from, and the buffalo will return as well. So if the Native Americans participate in this ghost dance movement. And then obviously neither one of those things happen, and so it kind of goes away after a little while. And then the second one is also 1890. So both these happened around 1890. Is the massacre at Wounded Knee. This, kind of like the Sand Creek massacre in the 1860s, is white soldiers that come in and they kill men, women, and children. And this kind of really effectively ends any kind of resistance of Native Americans at that point. Okay, so when you look at these time periods, you have kind of this movement off the land, this violent time frame, and then you kind of have this movement towards assimilation of bringing Native Americans and kind of civilizing them into kind of a white culture. And so their relationship between American settlers and Native tribes, I think is safe to say, kind of deteriorates and goes down over time.